Hi everyone, welcome to the Prezi Big Ideas 2021 campaign. My name is Shelley Osborne and I am so excited to be here to talk about the upskilling imperative and how we can create a culture of learning in our organizations. It's something that I think we all have the responsibility for, and it's so important to think differently about how organizations can become learning organizations. But before I dig into all of that, I actually kind of want to go off on a tangent for a moment, if you'll join me. And I want to talk about the apps on our phone. Now, I know that everybody has favorite apps on their phones. That's just true. And I want you to think for a moment about your own favorite. And before we talk about that, I want to show you one of my favorites. And as you're looking at this, I hope you can guess, maybe think a little bit about what might this be. What app am I showing you here on the screen? And believe it or not, it's actually the original version of Airbnb. Phenomenal company, hugely successful company. And today this is what the app looks like. It really did start all the way back here with this suitcase app, and it's evolved into an entirely different company. And you can imagine along the way, the app has had all sorts of little changes and releases and adjustments. The company has shifted and evolved its thinking numerous times, really reinventing themselves and considering new ways. And that's been part of the evolution of the app as well. They've had releases over time, slight iterations and changes. Now, I want you to imagine that favorite app of yours I asked you to think about a second ago, the one that you're addicted to, whichever one you open up first thing in the morning every day and you just can't help but look at. Now, what if that app only changed once a year? Or even less, never changed at all? In fact, software used to develop entirely differently. They used to send these boxes of CDs out to people's homes, and that was actually how we got new updates on the products we were using. We often had to sit there for hours and hours loading each CD into the computer to update the new software. And they were these big, huge waterfall releases, huge versions of software. But nowadays, that's not how it goes. We do small, little releases over time. So an app like Airbnb starts in that first version of itself, that suitcase version. And over time, through little releases and through big, big updates, it evolves and becomes something different. And we expect that. We expect to plug in our phones at night and have those updates and those changes happening much more quickly than we ever used to have. Now, it's important for us to think about ourselves that very same way and to consider ourselves in that agile software development lens. Now, I love reading product releases. If you haven't ever checked it out, go into the apps you're downloading and check out their product releases. There's even Medium blogs that capture the funniest ones. But I think it's an interesting way to think about ourselves as well. And if I think about myself and the development I've gone through even just this year, as we're facing a global pandemic, as we're challenged with new learning and new ways of working, I've had to develop and have some little releases and some bigger releases too. Now, this first version, release 3.45, was more early days in the pandemic. It was when we were thinking about this immediacy of everybody suddenly working from home, of the world shifting, of the world being a very different place. And I knew that I needed to focus on making sure I still gave my team feedback and that there was transparency even while we were remote, and that it isn't something that we dropped because we weren't in an office together. Now, along the way, I needed another little release. I wasn't done learning. I wasn't done growing. And as a leader, I knew that suddenly I noticed there was less feedback coming my way. And I needed to develop and learn a little bit more and ask my team to be giving me more feedback. And these are little tweaks, these are little changes. But just like the apps on our phone, we need to constantly be iterating and developing and having these little releases and sometimes these big releases as we are growing. Now, for me, I think that upskilling is iteration and updating for ourselves. And it's an imperative, especially these days when there is so much change and there's so much new coming for us. We need to be embarking on these little software developments, these little tweaks, these little releases, and those big ones as well, and considering ourselves learners all the time, and that upskilling is our imperative. Now today I want to talk about 5 ways that we can make learning core to the way we work. I'm going to dive into each of these. These are the 5 core pieces I share in my book, and I want to share a couple of examples today in this talk and dive a little bit into how it can come to life in any organization. Up first, I want to talk about what it means to develop and foster agile learners. Now, agile learners are those who are open to learning all the time, who see learning as the way forward to their challenges. Now, my husband and I, this is us on a walk. We take what I like to call walkie-talkies, and we've been really, really good about these during the pandemic because we're stuck in our offices working from home all the time, and I think it's been really important to get us up and out and moving. So this is a picture from us on one of our walkie-talkies, and he'll probably kill me later because this is our quarantine haircuts as well. Very early days in the pandemic before we could even really access a haircut. But on these walkie-talkies, and this is, I guess, sort of the upside or the downside of being married to a learning professional, we're always talking about learning and reflecting and thinking about what we've done recently, what we've learned recently. And we ask ourselves a series of questions to get us really thinking about what we've learned in the past and where we need to go in the future. And those questions are fundamental because they ask us to take into account our experiences, but then also start to be predictive about where we need to go. And it's something that I use also with my team. It's not just something I reserve for Tom and I on our walkie-talkies, but I use this in offsites and I use this with executives, and it's so helpful to ground us in our learning. And the 3 questions are, what have I learned before? And when I say before, it can be in another job, it could be in another environment or setting, whatever it is, but that's becoming applicable to your current situation. What did I learn today? And then for this one, I don't actually mean literally today. It could just be in the very, very recent history or past. What am I learning right now that's becoming relevant or important to me, or that I'm going to need to use in the future? And then what do I need to learn next? Recognizing either through that recency or through looking at past experiences, what you might need to be more successful, to be continuing in your learning journey, or to step into a new role or to develop something completely new. And asking these 3 questions starts to develop a muscle. It starts to develop that perspective of those little tweaks, those little changes in our software, those little adds, but also gives us space to think about those big additions, those big software releases that we want to add to ourselves as people as we continue to grow. Now, when we're thinking about those 5 ways to make learning core to the way we work, there's also a real importance to focus on feedback. And I like to say that feedback is fuel. It is just like the air we need. It's like the water we drink, the food we eat every day. It is fuel for our growth and development. And oftentimes people say feedback is a gift, and sure it can be, but I can go forever without a gift, but I need fuel. I need fuel to survive. And that's what feedback is. And it's easy to take it for granted. It's easy to assume that it's happening in an organization. It's easy to have it happen only a couple of times a year. But for a company to become a learning culture, it really needs to be rooted in a culture of feedback, all ways, up, down, sideways, constructive, positive feedback all the time, as much as possible. Now, what matters for that to happen is that it needs to be embraced from the very top, but it also needs to be embraced at all levels of the organization. So we need to teach everyone to give feedback. Oftentimes we save that just for managers. We only bother to teach those folks how to give feedback. Well, think about how powerful it is for an individual contributor to give that feedback really effectively to their manager. And we need to embrace it at the top for sure, and it needs to be lived and it needs to be realized. So leaders need to not only give feedback, but create spaces where feedback is asked for and accepted and welcomed. We need to socialize failures as learning. We don't talk about failure without pointing out the learnings along the way and realize that you didn't fail, you learned. And we really do want to change the branding. When we started working on Feedback is Fuel at Udemy, it was very, very important that we didn't give it this negative connotation feedback almost always has. So we actually worked with our marketing team to brand it as Feedback is Fuel, recognizing that it needed a bit of a rebrand. And now at Udemy, I am an absolute broken record. I don't know if a day goes by, certainly not a week goes by, where I'm not saying in some sort of public all hands, or someone else, a leader at the company, isn't saying in a very public way that feedback is fuel. It's taken a life of its own, and it's my job to continue to be that broken record, but it lives within the organization, and it's shared and evangelized by all. Now, we work really hard to make feedback continuous, and we do a lot of things. When we first launched this program, we started with campaigns around asking 3 people for feedback and giving prizes. That circle Feedback is Fuel logo is stickers that we've given out so people can put them on their laptops or their water bottles, whatever. But we've really, really embraced giving it a very positive vibe, and then bringing it into all parts of the employee life cycle, not just this performance review perspective that many companies have. And we also really focus on giving people the empowerment to talk about what feedback should look like and how they feel about it. So we've really dug into people's own experiences and perspectives, having them share when they like to receive feedback with their managers, and asking them to have those very, very open conversations, something not always done. Now, that Feedback is Fuel program was one of the first ways at Udemy we really thought about how to think like a marketer. And that's the next way to make learning core to the way we work. And it is one of the most important things. I shared a few examples there with Feedback is Fuel, and I'd love to share more about how marketing is essential to creating a learning culture. The truth is, if people aren't listening, it's because we're not speaking their language. We aren't actually communicating with them in the ways that are meaningful for them. And a lot of this comes down to how we can creatively market and make campaigns to share the learning experiences, the actual assets, the content and the knowledge we want to give them. And creativity, it's not an art. I know so many folks feel like, oh gosh, I'm not creative, I can't be creative. But creativity is actually a skill. And as we're thinking about building learning cultures, as we're thinking about getting people engaged with programs, we need to embed creativity. We need to speak their language. We need to capture their attention in a sea of, well, a lot of noise, especially in a time when we're all working remotely and we were inundated by so much text, so many messages, so many news stories. Now, I have a creativity framework that I use when thinking about how to create creative campaigns, creative programs, really creative educational experiences. And in a nutshell, it comes down to giving yourself freedom to think differently about the work you're doing. So it comes down to consuming. What are you reading? What are you watching? With Feedback is Fuel, we actually launched that campaign with a parody of Jimmy Kimmel's mean tweets called Mean Feedback. And we came up with that idea by thinking about what we watched on TV, the movies we watch, the books we read. Look for inspiration there. We thought about flipping the script with other programs. What's the opposite of what we're trying to do? We looked at following others. So it is a great thing to find inspiration in the work that others do. I often follow teachers. I'm a former teacher, and I look at the creative ways they're engaging people in their classrooms, their students, and how we can bring that into the corporate education space. It's about finding connections. How can we connect what we're doing with other things that are happening for folks? And most importantly, leaving space for incubation, leaving time for you to surface and popcorn up these creative ideas. Now, this example comes from a pre-pandemic story, but one of the most creative programs we've put together was based on a program that we were doing to break down silos in a team. We heard from the leader at the time that there were a lot of silos. Groups weren't working well together. And he wanted to do something really, really creative to show folks how working together was far stronger than breaking apart into teams. So we actually replicated a Top Chef style challenge where we asked teams to work on creating food trucks. And we told them that the whole goal, was to throw a great party for their teams. But what happened was they immediately broke into teams and started competing against each other, rather than realizing their goal was to collectively throw a party. Now, this actual learning experience allowed us to have deep and meaningful conversations about what it means to work collaboratively. And it was also incredibly creative. Despite the fact that it was very different than their day-to-day work, it actually allowed us to surface some of the lessons, the habits, and the things that are happening in the organization in a way that created space for meaningful conversation. And we did it in an incredibly creative way. Now, this food truck challenge we put together is one of the favorite events we've ever done at Udemy. And it was inspired by all of those methods I shared in that creativity framework. It was about what we consume. The leader we were working with is obsessed with the TV program Top Chef, and that inspired us. We tried to look at creating the opposite. What's the opposite of working together? Well, let's break them into this perspective where they suddenly think they have to be competing in teams. And it allowed us to have great conversations. We looked at teachers and other groups had replicated these kinds of challenges. So thinking creatively is a skill. It's not an art. You can put together the steps and you can take those steps to come up with really creative and interesting ideas. Now, next up is one of my favorites. It's putting learning into the flow of work. Now, this is something that is so essential today. It is no longer acceptable or suitable to go spend days away taking a learning or a training. We need to learn as we go. We need to learn in the moment. Now, I like to liken this to a really famous architectural principle, which is this idea of the pyramid or the triangle in your kitchen. And the best kitchens are actually designed in such a way that the workstation, the cook station, and the refrigerator are all in a perfect triangle. So they are set up so that it's real easy, that you are perfectly positioned to reach for that exact drawer, to turn to your right and open the refrigerator. It's perfectly set up. It doesn't matter the size of your kitchen. If it's a big, beautiful kitchen like this one or a smaller one, you really do want to have it set up in such a way that there's that triangle. And learning should be the same way. It should become muscle memory, that drawer is right where you need it, where you access that learning, that the refrigerator door is second nature to open, so is your access to learning and development. And it's easy to insert into the flow of your workstation. That's what learning in the flow of work is. Ways we can think about doing that in organizations include having learning budgets for everyone in the company, not just those people we call so-called high potentials. Everyone has potential. There should be dedicated time to learn, time set aside within the organization, and then autonomy over learning. Certainly we want to give people direction and guidance, but we also want to give them the opportunity to learn what's important and relevant for their role. We'll never fully understand every single role. We want to give people the ownership and empowerment to do that. We want to build it into career paths and into career development that learning is a big part of the conversation. And you want to think about tools like Udemy for Business, a digital content catalog where you can actually access learning like that drawer at your moment of need. You want to build that muscle memory and have that drawer ready for folks. An example of this recently with my team, as we sort of began working in this pandemic, we realized that we needed to do some better project management and work asynchronously a little bit differently. So my entire team moved every single project onto Asana. And some people were Asana pros and some people were entirely new to this way of working. Now for us, what that meant was that we needed to do a little bit of learning for some folks, and some folks were ready to go. I was able to show folks real quickly an Asana project management course on the Udemy platform, and even pointed them just to the couple of lectures that would get them started. You don't even necessarily want folks to be watching the entire course. You want them to watch that nugget of learning that gets them going, that gets them started on the work they need to do. That is putting learning into the flow of work. Now, up next is maybe the most important one, and without it, this all will fail. It's signaling the value of learning. Because none of this will work, none, truly none, if leaders aren't involved. And that means leaders at the top of your organization and leaders at every level of your organization. For managers and leaders to signal the value of learning, what they need to do is talk about their own failure and talk about it as learning. Talk about how they learned through those moments. Open up about their own learning experiences. Advocate from the top for learning to happen within the organization, and to socialize that learning is never done. It's so meaningful when a super senior leader is talking about what they're learning next and what they're developing in. I have an example here of one of our most senior leaders at Udemy. Our SVP of Marketing, Liebert, finished our Udemy Manager curriculum recently. He was actually among the first 5 people who graduated, and he immediately shared with all of the managers at Udemy how meaningful that work was for him, how important it was to reflect on his management lessons and continue to develop in his manager journey. I can't say enough for leaders who do this, who take that moment to share what they're doing, how they're continuing to develop, and have that vulnerability. Now, this learning can't sort of just happen on odd days. It has to be those iterations. It has to be a constant flow of little developments like the software we talked about at the beginning of this chat. It's mini tweaks and it's big releases. It's developing in all ways constantly. This is how we need to think about ourselves, like the software on our phones. Now, I'm so happy that I was able to share with you all those 5 ways to make learning core to the way we work. I'd love to stay connected. You can always connect with me on LinkedIn. You can check out my website, theupskillingimperative.com, or check out my book on Amazon. It was a pleasure to share with you all today. Thank you very much.